All right, let's talk about Pearl Harbor. But I'm gonna bet this isn't the story you're used to hearing. We're gonna peel back the layers of the explosions and the headlines to get to a much deeper and honestly, a much more chilling story. One that really began not with a bang, but with a question. Imagine this. It's the night before the attack, December 6th, 1941. And that quote, that's the quiet fear nagging at a Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Zenji Abe. As he stood on that freezing flight deck, this was the question that was haunting him, a question that was about to be answered in the most brutal way imaginable. Because this isn't really a story about military victory. It's the story of a nation's slow, dawning, and horrifying realization that they hadn't crippled an enemy. They had basically just poked a sleeping giant, a giant that was about to wake up and bury them under a mountain of steel. So you gotta ask, right? Why would any nation take such a massive, world-altering gamble? Well, the path to Pearl Harbor wasn't paved with confidence. It was paved with pure, raw desperation. And that desperation? It all came down to one thing: oil. You see, in July of 41, the United States just turned off the tap. 80% of Japan's oil supply, gone. Just like that. All of a sudden, their entire war machine, their whole empire, had an 18-month expiration date. The clock was officially ticking.
But here's the thing. There was one guy high up in the Japanese command who knew exactly what they were getting into: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Now, America wasn't some abstract enemy on a map to him. He'd lived in the States, studied at Harvard, served in Washington, D.C. He had seen the smokestacks. He understood the sheer scale of the place.
And listen to this. A full year before Pearl Harbor, he wrote this chillingly accurate prediction in a letter. He basically said that a quick, clean victory was a total fantasy. To really win, they'd have to march all the way to the White House and dictate the peace terms themselves. He knew, deep down, it was impossible. So his strategy, it was never about conquering America. Not at all. Think of it as the ultimate gambler's bet. The plan was to land a stunning knockout punch on the Pacific Fleet. That would buy them maybe 6 months, a year, tops, to go out and grab all the oil and rubber they needed from Southeast Asia. And then, and this is the absolute key part, they hoped to force a negotiated peace before America's real power, its industrial engine, could even get out of first gear. And that knockout punch? Man, from a purely military perspective, it was a masterpiece. Absolutely flawless execution. Just think about the timing here. In a little over an hour, they pulled it off. The famous signal, Tora, 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 crackled over the radio. It meant tiger, 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 the code that they'd achieved complete and total surprise. On paper, it was a massive, overwhelming victory. But, and this is the crucial turning point of the whole story, what if the most important targets weren't the battleships they hit, but the ones they missed completely? So they had a choice. The lead pilot was practically begging his commander, Vice Admiral Nagumo, let's send a third wave. Let's finish the job. But Nagumo played it safe. He chose to pull back. And what did he leave behind? The massive oil tanks. Enough fuel to keep the U.S. Navy operating for months. The submarine base, the critical repair docks. And oh yeah, the 3 American aircraft carriers, they weren't even there. They were out at sea, totally untouched. That single decision would turn out to be a fatal strategic blunder. So as those pilots flew back to their carriers, that initial thrill of victory, it started to fade. And that question that Lieutenant Abe had, it started creeping back in. They had just seen the sheer scale of that American base. And a horrifying thought began to form. A thought that would be proven right by some very simple, very brutal math. Because the real answer to are they a weakened nation wasn't on a burning battleship. It was on a factory floor. Get this, in 1941, before America was even officially in the war, it was already building almost 4 times as many airplanes as Japan. The war was already lost on the production line, and the first shots had barely been fired. And after Pearl Harbor, well, that gap didn't just widen. It became an ocean. America's industrial might was about to be fully and terrifyingly unleashed. Just look at this one number, 24. That's how many Essex-class aircraft carriers the U.S. built during the war. And we're not talking about small ships. These were massive, floating cities with their own air force, 24 of them. To put that in perspective, America built more of just one class of carrier than Japan had in its entire navy for the whole war. By 1943, the numbers just get insane. American factories were cranking out so many planes that in just 2 months, they produced more than Japan could build in an entire year. It was a literal tidal wave of steel and aluminum. And can you imagine being a Japanese pilot trying to fight that? You're skilled, you're brave, but it just doesn't matter. You shoot one plane down and 10 more seem to appear on the horizon. One of them wrote home, and his words are just heartbreaking. Where are all these aircraft coming from? They realized they weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting an assembly line. And you can't shoot down an assembly line. And that assembly line, the speed was just mind-boggling. As a sort of publicity stunt, one shipyard decided to see how fast they could build a huge 10,000-ton cargo ship, the SS Robert E. Peary. They went from laying the first piece of steel to launching the entire finished ship in 4 days and 15 hours, less than 5 days. They built an entire ship faster than most workshops could repair a single damaged bomber. When you look at the final production numbers for the entire war, it's game over. Nearly 300,000 U.S. aircraft to Japan's 76,000, 86,000 American tanks to Japan's 2,500. It wasn't a war of equals, it was an industrial avalanche. And all of this brings us right back to where we started, to that one single brilliance and yet completely catastrophic decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's prediction came true almost to the day. He said they'd run wild for 6 months, and they did. But he also said that after that, he had utterly no confidence, and he was right. He was actually killed in 1943, shot down from the sky, so he never saw the full, horrifying scale of the industrial giant he had been forced to awaken. But he knew. Right from the very beginning, he knew. In the end, it was America's factories that truly won the war in the Pacific. They didn't just outfight Japan. They made fighting a sustainable war impossible through sheer, overwhelming, relentless production. So here's the ultimate paradox, the thing to really take away from all of this. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a brilliant tactical success that guaranteed a catastrophic strategic defeat. The Japanese pilots did their job perfectly, but in doing so, they didn't cripple a weakened nation. They woke a sleeping giant and basically handed it a giant cup of coffee and an alarm clock. And that's really why this story from 80 years ago still matters so much today. It forces us to ask a tough question. In our modern world of cyber warfare, of drones, of asymmetric conflicts, does that kind of overwhelming industrial power still guarantee victory? What does a sleeping giant even look like in the 21st century? And maybe more importantly, who has it?